Devon Calloway pulled into the parking lot of the Hargrove Natural History Museum at 11:43 on a Tuesday night, 17 minutes before his shift was set to begin, because that was the kind of man he was. He had worked security for 11 years across 4 different posts, a casino, 2 hospitals, and a private university campus. And all that time, he had never once been late, never once left early, and never once let the quiet of a late shift convince him that quiet meant safe. He sat in his car for a few minutes with the engine running, looking at the building through the windshield. The Hargrove was an old structure, 3 stories of dark stone with tall arched windows, and a facade that belonged more to the previous century than the current one. The city had grown up around it over the decades, and now it sat wedged between a parking garage and a glass-fronted office building like something that had refused to move when everything else changed. The lights along the front entrance were on, amber and dim, and the marquee sign near the road still displayed the previous month's featured exhibit in letters that someone had not gotten around to changing. Devon cut the engine, grabbed his thermos off the passenger seat, and went inside. The outgoing officer, a man named Paul who Devon had only met once during his orientation walkthrough, was already packed up and waiting near the front desk with his jacket on and his bag over his shoulder. Paul gave Devon a handshake and a rundown that lasted less than 4 minutes. Camera logging on the desk, round schedule printed and laminated on the clipboard. East wing motion sensors had been running a little hot, so don't panic if they trip, and the loading dock door on the south side needed to be checked twice because the latch did not always catch on the first push. Then Paul was gone and Devon was alone. He stood at the front desk for a moment and looked out at the main hall. The museum after hours was a different place than the museum during the day, and Devon had expected that. He had worked enough night shifts to know that any large building empty to people took on a different quality, a kind of hell-breath stillness that could feel peaceful or unsettling depending on your disposition. The Hargrove leaned unsettling. The main hall stretched out in front of him, high-ceilinged and shadow-heavy, the display cases catching just enough of the ambient light to give off a faint gloss. The large skeletal reconstructions positioned throughout the space. A prehistoric predator mounted mid-stride near the south wall, a massive marine creature suspended from the ceiling on near-invisible cables, became something different in the dark. Not threatening exactly, but present in a way that daylight dissolved. Devon did not linger. He logged into the camera system, ran a quick check to confirm all feeds were active, noted the timestamp, and started his first round. The round took 42 minutes the first time because he was being thorough, checking every door, every window latch, every back corridor and storage alcove that the laminated sheet listed as part of the route. The east wing was the oldest part of the building and felt it. The floors had a particular creak. The air ran noticeably colder than the rest of the museum, and the exhibits in that section had a different character than the ones in the main hall. Where the main hall favored scale and spectacle, the east wing favored density. Cases packed with artifacts, walls hung with framed documentation, placards dense with text, objects arranged with a kind of careful deliberateness that suggested every inch of space had been argued over. Devon moved through it slowly, flashlight tracing the cases, and felt the particular awareness that the space seemed to generate. Not fear, not quite, but heightened attentiveness, a sense that he was being observed in return for his observing. He finished the east wing, moved through the second floor galleries, checked the loading dock latch twice as instructed, and came back to the front desk. Everything was in order. He made his notes on the clipboard, poured a cup of coffee from his thermos, and settled in. His second round started at 2 a.m. The museum was exactly as he had left it until he reached the main hall and stopped. The central display case, the one positioned directly beneath the suspended marine skeleton, the one that housed what the placard identified as skeletal remains from an ancient ceremonial burial excavated in the early 20th century, looked different. Devon stepped closer and put his flashlight on it. The remains were arranged on a bed of dark fabric inside the case. The bones of what appeared to be a single adult laid out in a formal configuration. He had looked at this case during his first round, had noted it the way he noted everything, and he was certain with the particular certainty of someone trained to observe, that the left hand of the skeleton had been lying flat against the display fabric, fingers extended, palm downward. It was not lying flat now. The hand was raised at the wrist, fingers curled inward, the posture of someone who had reached for something in the dark. Devon stood very still. He looked at the hand for a long time. He looked at the case for signs of tampering. The lock, the seal along the edges of glass, the fabric beneath the bones. Nothing appeared disturbed. The glass was clean. The lock was intact. He straightened up and finished his round without finding anything else out of place, and told himself there was a reasonable explanation, that he had misremembered the position of the hand, that the first round had been a lot of new information and details blurred together on a first night. He was almost convinced by the time he clocked out at 6 in the morning. He was in his car, engine running, thermos empty on the passenger seat, and he pulled up the camera app on his phone to do one final check the way he always did before leaving a post. He scrolled through the overnight feeds. Everything was unremarkable until 2:17 a.m. on the main hall camera, at which point the feed went to black. Devon sat forward. The black lasted 4 minutes. He timed it, watching the timestamp tick, and then the feed returned. The main hall exactly as it had been, nothing visibly different. The display case sitting in the center of the frame under the pale ambient light. Devon rewound it, watched it again. The cut was clean, not the gradual static of a technical fault, but an immediate, total blackout, as if the camera had been switched off at the source. He checked the other cameras. None of them showed any interruption at 2:17 a.m. Only the main hall. Devon sat in the parking lot for a while after that, the engine idling, looking at the still image of the main hall on his phone screen, at the display case just visible in the lower right of the frame. He thought about the hand. He thought about 4 minutes of nothing. Then he put the car in gear and drove home, and he did not sleep well, and when his alarm went off that evening, he got up, put on his uniform, and drove back. The second night was worse. Not dramatically. There were no sounds he could not explain, no figures in the corridors, nothing that would have made a reasonable person panic. But the sense of being observed that he had noticed in the east wing on the first night was stronger now and no longer confined to the east wing. He felt it in the main hall, felt it on the second floor, felt it most acutely in the moments when he turned his back on the central display case to continue his round. He did not turn his back on it for long. He checked the case at the start of every round and photographed it with his phone, a habit he had developed without consciously deciding to, log in position of every visible bone the way he would log a door or a window latch. Because something in him had already decided this was a thing that needed watching. On the second night, the hand was back in its flat position. Devon stared at it for a long time, genuinely unsure whether that was better or worse. He checked the camera footage from the previous night again, and the 2:17 a.m. blackout was there for minutes, clean cut, same as before. He started a notes document on his phone and began writing down everything he could remember about the case from his first round on night 1. The exact position of every bone he had noted, the angle of the head, the arrangement of the ribs, the placement of both hands. On the third night, he arrived with his notes and stood in front of the case and compared what he saw to what he had written down. 3 things were different, not dramatically different. A degree of rotation in the position of the skull, a rib that had shifted its overlap with the one beside it, the right foot angled slightly inward where it had been straight before. Small changes. The kind of changes a person could dismiss as misremembered detail if they were looking for a reason to dismiss them. Devon was not looking for a reason to dismiss them. He called Mickey on dispatch around 3 in the morning, keeping his voice level, and described the camera blackouts. Mickey told him it was probably the building's wiring, that old structures did strange things with their electrical systems, and asked if anything else was malfunctioning. Devon said no and ended the call. He stood in the main hall after that and looked at the display case in the ambient light and thought about the donor plaque mounted on the wall to the left of it. the one he had read on his first round without thinking much of it. The plaque credited the acquisition of the ceremonial burial remains to a private donor, an archaeologist named Edmund Crew, who had gifted collection to the Hargrove in 1947. Devon had not thought anything of it at the time. Now he walked over to the museum's public information terminal near the main entrance and searched the name. The results were thin. A brief mention in a digitized museum newsletter from 1948, a partial bibliography on an academic archive site, a scanned photograph in the museum's own online collection showing a group of men at an excavation site, squinting into what appeared to be harsh sunlight. One of them identified in the caption as E. Crew. Devon looked at the photograph for a while. Then he looked back at the display case across the hall. Then he went to the desk and found the door to the basement archive and stood in front of it, thinking, until his round timer went off and he had to move. He finished the night without incident, but when he reviewed the footage in the parking lot before driving home, the 2:17 a.m. blackout was there again for minutes, and when the feed came back, the hand was raised. He sat with that for a long time before he started the engine. The hand had been flat. When he checked the case at the start of his last round, it was raised in the footage. Whatever was happening inside, that case was happening in those 4 minutes, in the dark, with the camera off, and Devon Calloway had been somewhere else in the building while it did. He put the car in gear, pulled out of the lot, and made a decision on the drive home that he would be back the following night with a flashlight that had fresh batteries, a full charge on his phone, and a plan to get into that basement archive before 2:17 a.m. came around again. Devon had worked enough strange posts in his career to know the difference between a building that was simply old and a building that had something wrong with it. The casino had been old. 40 years of cigarette smoke baked into the walls. Elevators had grown like they resented every trip. A basement boiler room that made sounds at 3 a.m. that new officers always came upstairs pale-faced about. But the casino had never made Devon feel watched. The Hargrove did, and by the 4th night, it was no longer a background sensation he could file away and ignore. It was specific. It came from the main hall. More specifically, it came from the central display case, and it was strongest in the moments just after 2:17 a.m., in the window after the camera came back on, and Devon was doing his round somewhere else in the building, unaware of what had just moved in the dark behind him. He changed his round schedule on the 4th night, without asking anyone's permission. Instead of following the laminated sheet in the order was printed, he rearranged the sequence so that he was in the main hall at 2:15 a.m. and stayed there through 2:21 a.m., standing in front of the display case with his flashlight off, watching. Nothing happened. The hall was still. The case was still. 2:17 a.m. came and went, and the bones did not move, and when he checked the camera footage later, the feed showed no blackout. Devon stood in the dark and considered that for a long time. He went back to the desk and pulled up the footage from the previous 3 nights side by side on the monitor, scrubbing the 2:17 a.m. on each one. The blackout on night 1 for minutes. The blackout on night 2 for minutes. The blackout on night 3 for minutes. Tonight, nothing. The only variable was his own location. On the nights the blackout occurred, he had been on the 2nd floor or in the east wing at 2:17 a.m., away from the main hall. Tonight, he had been standing directly in front of the case. Devon wrote that down in his notes document and stared at what he had written for a while. Whatever was happening in those 4 minutes did not happen when he was watching. He thought about what that meant. He thought about it for the rest of the night, and he did not come to a conclusion that made him feel any better. On the 5th night, he went back to following the laminated schedule, putting himself away from the main hall at 2:17 a.m. the way the original round sequence dictated. And at 2:17 a.m. the camera went black for 4 minutes, and when it came back on the skull, had rotated further, and 2 of the smaller finger bones on the right hand had separated from the arrangement and moved approximately 4 inches to the left. Devon photographed everything. He had a folder on his phone now with 63 photographs sorted by date and time, and when he laid them out in sequence, they told a story he did not want to think about too directly. The bones were moving towards something, not randomly. There was nothing random about it. Each change built on the previous one with the kind of deliberate incrementalism that suggested either an intelligence or a process, and Devon was not sure which of those options was less troubling. He called Mickey again on the 5th night, this time asking about the camera system specifically, whether the main hall unit had any documented history of outages, whether there had been complaints from previous officers. Mickey put him on hold for 3 minutes and came back to tell him the system had been replaced 18 months ago and the log showed no reported issues. Devon thanked him and hung up and went and stood in front of the display case on his next round and looked at the bones and thought about Edmund Crew. He had done more searching on the public terminal over the past few nights, pulling together whatever fragments the internet had on the man. Crew had been a mid-tier academic archaeologist, affiliated with a university that had since merged with a larger institution, active in the field between roughly 1919 and 1944. His published work was sparse, and Devon had only been able to find titles, not full texts, 3 monographs on excavation methodology, and one that stood apart from the others, listed in a digitized academic catalog under the title concerning the ritual interment practices of isolated pre-contact communities, published in 1941. Devon had tried to find a digital copy and failed. The museum's own records on Crew were limited to the donor acknowledgement and a brief biography in an old newsletter that described him as a distinguished benefactor and noted his gift of the ceremonial burial collection without elaborating on where the collection had come from or what the circumstances of its excavation had been. The plaque near the display case said the remains dated to an unspecified pre-contact period and had been recovered from a site in the northern interior, which Devon had initially read as geographic description and now read as deliberate vagueness. On the 6th night, Devon found the basement archive door unlocked. He did not know if it had been unlocked before. He had tried it only once, on the 3rd night, and found it locked and had not tried it again since. Tonight the handle turned freely. He stood in the doorway and shone his flashlight down the staircase and thought about the fact that it had a job to do and a round schedule to keep, and that going into an unsecured basement in the middle of the night was not technically part of either. Then he thought about 63 photographs in a 4-minute blackout, and the way the bones kept moving when his back was turned, and he went down the stairs. The archive was a long, low ceiling room that smelled of paper and cold stone, lined on both sides with metal shelving units packed with labeled boxes and flat archival drawers. A single fluorescent tube flickered on when he found the light switch, casting the room in a particular flat brightness that made everything look equally significant and equally mundane. Devon moved along the shelves slowly, reading labels. The collection was organized by donor name and acquisition date, and it did not take him long to find a section marked Crew E, 1947 acquisition. There were 4 boxes. Devon pulled the first one and set it on the small table near the light switch and opened it. Inside were folders of documents, correspondence, acquisition paperwork, chain of custody records for the donated items. He flipped through them carefully, reading enough of each to understand what he was looking at before moving to the next. The paperwork was thorough and told him very little he did not already know. The second box held more correspondence, this time between Crew and the museum's director at the time, a man named Arthur Fenn. The letters were formal and mostly administrative: shipping arrangements, insurance valuation, display specifications. But near the bottom of the box, Devon found a letter that was different in tone from the others. It was dated 3 months before the official donation, and it was not administrative. It was a letter from Crew to Fenn that ran 4 pages in a cramped handwriting that grew progressively less controlled as it went on. Devon read it standing at the table with his flashlight as backup against the flickering fluorescent and felt the particular cold that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. He read it twice to make sure he had understood it correctly. Then he put it back in the folder, put the folder back in the box, put the box back on the shelf, turned off the light, and went back upstairs. He did the rest of his round on autopilot, checking doors and latches without really seeing them, his mind working through what the letter had said. He was back at the front desk by 4:30, and he sat there until 6 with the camera feeds up on the monitor and Crew's words turning over and over in his head. The footage at 2:17 a.m. showed the blackout for minutes, and when it came back on, Devon could see even from the desk camera angle that the arrangement inside the case had changed again. He did not go look at it up close. Not tonight. He needed to read the rest of those boxes first, and he needed to think, and he needed to figure out who at this museum knew what they had in that case, because Edmund Crew's letter to Arthur Fenn had been very clear on one point above all others. The remains in that display case were not the remains of a person. He needed to understand what it was, and more urgently, he needed to understand what it was becoming, because based on his photographs and the pattern of movement he had been logging for 6 nights, it was becoming something fast. The bones had been scattered and disorganized when he started. They were less scattered now. The arrangement inside that case had a direction to it, a coherence that had not been there on night 1. And whatever intelligence was guiding that process had been at it long before Devon Calloway showed up for his first shift. He had simply been the first person to notice, or the first person to stay long enough to admit what he was noticing. He thought about Paul, the outgoing officer, packed and ready to leave before Devon had even clocked in on his first night. He thought about the way Paul had given the rundown in under 4 minutes without once mentioning the display case or the East Wing cold or the feeling of being watched. Either Paul had not noticed, or Paul had noticed and had not said anything. And Devon was not sure which of those was more telling. He locked the front desk, put his clipboard in his bag, and walked to his car in the gray early morning light. He sat behind the wheel and looked at his phone, at the folder of photographs, at 63 images of incremental wrongness that he had documented over 6 nights like a man building a case. He supposed that was exactly what he was doing, building a case. The question now was what he intended to do with it, and who, if anyone, he could take it to without sounding like someone who had spent too many nights alone in a dark building and let his imagination get ahead of him. He started the car. He would sleep. He would come back tonight. He would read the rest of Crew's boxes, and he would figure out what was in that case before it finished figuring out how to get out of it. That last thought sat with him longer than the others as he pulled out of the parking lot and onto the empty early morning street, because it carried with it an assumption he had not fully examined until right now, the assumption that it was not already out. He had been so focused on the movement inside the case, on the bones and their shifting arrangement, that he had not seriously asked himself whether the thing responsible for moving them was necessarily contained within the glass. The case was locked, yes, the glass was intact. But Devon had been in that building for 6 nights, and something had been watching him for most of them, and whatever was doing the watching had not needed to break any glass to do it. He drove home with that thought, and did not manage to put it down, and when he finally fell asleep late that morning, it followed him there too. Devon slept 4 hours and spent the rest of the day at his kitchen table with a legal pad and his phone, trying to reconstruct from memory everything he had read in that first letter from Edmund Crew to Arthur Fenn. He had not photographed it, a mistake he intended to correct tonight, but he had read it twice, and his memory for detail was one of the things 11 years of security work had sharpened to a reliable edge. Crew had written the letter in what Devon now recognized as a state of controlled panic, the kind of panic that a certain type of methodical, academic man produces when he is frightened but still committed to sounding rational. The letter opened with administrative language, discussing the forthcoming donation in the same formal register as all the other correspondence Devon had seen. And then somewhere in the second page, that register broke down. Crew had written that he was donating the collection not out of generosity, but out of necessity. He had written that the remains could not stay where they were, meaning, Devon inferred, wherever Crew had been keeping in the years since the excavation, because proximity over time produced effects that Crew described only as accelerating and did not elaborate on. He had written that a museum was the correct destination, because a museum would keep the pieces together and properly separated, which Devon had read twice before understanding that crew meant separated from each other, that the specific distances between individual bones mattered, that the arrangement was not decorative but functional, and that the museum display as Crew had specified in his accompanying notes was not an aesthetic choice but a precise technical requirement. He had written in the third page, in handwriting that had begun to crowd the margins, the site was a containment, not a burial. We understood that too late. What is interred there was not placed to be honored or preserved, but to be kept from reforming. I believe relocation was survivable if the internal arrangement was maintained. I am less certain of this now. And then in the fourth page, the last page, in handwriting that Devon had needed to tilt the paper toward the light to read, do not let anyone move them after they are placed. Do not alter the display. The arrangement is the only thing keeping it from knowing where its pieces are. Devon had read that last line 3 times standing at the archive table, and he read it again now in his memory, sitting at his kitchen table in daylight. And it did not become less alarming with repetition. The arrangement is the only thing keeping it from knowing where its pieces are. He wrote it on the legal pad and underlined it. Then he wrote below it, the arrangement has been changing for at least 6 nights. Then he sat back and looked at what he had written and thought about what it meant, which was that whatever process Crew had been trying to prevent with his precisely specified display configuration had been underway for at least as long as Devon had been watching it, and possibly much longer, and that Devon showing up for his shift 3 weeks ago had not started anything. He had simply arrived in time to witness the later stages of something that had been building in the dark of that museum for a very long time. He was at the Hargrove by 11:15 that night, 45 minutes early, and he was in the basement archive by 11:30. He photographed everything in the Crew boxes before he read any of it this time, working methodically through all 4 boxes with his phone camera, getting clear shots of every document front and back. And when he was done, he had 211 new photographs and a phone battery at 62%. Then he sat down at the archive table and started reading. The second and third boxes added detail to what he already knew. More correspondence with Fenn, shipping manifests, a hand-drawn diagram that Devon recognized as a layout of the display case with measurements and notations in Crew's cramped handwriting. Every bone labeled and its position specified to the nearest quarter inch. Devon photographed the diagram 3 times from different angles to make sure he had it clearly. The 4th box was different from the others. Where the first 3 had been administrative records, the 4th held what appeared to be Crew's personal field journals from the excavation itself. 3 cloth-bound notebooks in varying states of deterioration, their pages soft with age and covered in the same cramped handwriting Devon had come to recognize, accompanied throughout by small, precise sketches of the dig site, the artifact recovered, and the surrounding terrain. Devon handled them carefully, turning pages at the edges, and read with the focused attention of someone who understood he was not going to get a second chance at this. The first journal covered the early phase of the excavation, somewhere in the northern interior, as the museum plaque had vaguely noted, and was largely technical: soil composition, depth of finds, cataloging of surface artifacts. The tone was professional and dry. The second journal was where things changed. Crew had noted early in the second journal that the local people whose land bordered the site had sent representatives to the dig on 3 separate occasions to ask the team to stop. Devon read those passages carefully. Crew had recorded the conversations with the detachment of a man who had already decided they were not relevant, but the substance of what the representatives had said came through clearly enough even through Crew's dismissive framing. The site was not an ordinary burial ground. The things interred there were interred for reasons that had nothing to do with honoring the dead, and the specific arrangement of what was buried was not to be disturbed under any circumstances. Crew had noted these visits in his journal and continued digging. By the middle of the second journal, his entries had become longer and less technical, more given a description of atmosphere and sensation, an unease among the dig team that Crew attributed to remoteness of the location and the psychological effect of working around human remains, a persistent feeling among several team members of being observed. 2 workers who quit without explanation on the same day and walked out of sight without collecting their pay. Crew had written those details with the same detachment, but Devon could see the effort it was taking, could see the clinical language straining against something the man did not want to directly acknowledge. The 3rd journal was where Crew stopped being detached. It began with the discovery of what Crew called the primary deposit, the main concentration of remains at the center of the site, deeper than anything else they had found, arranged in a configuration that Crew described at length and that matched, Devon realized as he read, the diagram in the 3rd box, the precise layout of the museum display. Crew had not invented that arrangement. He had found it and replicated it, understanding by that point that it mattered, that it was not decorative. But replicating it had required disassembling it first, removing each piece in the ground and transporting it. And Devon read Crew's account of what happened in the days following the removal with a cold focus that he would think about later as the most frightened he had been without showing it. 3 members of the dig team had become disoriented in terrain they knew well and had taken hours to find their way back to camp. 1 man had reported waking in the night to find himself standing at the edge of the excavation pit with no memory of getting up. Crew himself had begun experiencing what he described as an awareness, a sense of something orienting toward him, locating him, the way a compass needle locates north. And he had written in the 3rd journal with the handwriting fully deteriorated now, the letters cramped and uneven, "It knows the pieces have moved. It is finding them. We must get them to the museum. The arrangement must be restored." Devon set the 3rd journal down on the table and sat very still for a moment. Then he went upstairs to check on the display case. The case was empty. He stood in front of it with his flashlight and looked at the dark fabric inside, and the place where the bones had been for the past 3 weeks of his shifts, and the place where they were not anymore. And then he heard something. It was not a loud sound. It was not a dramatic sound. It was a sound of something moving in the east wing, slow and deliberate, and it was coming closer. Devon did not move. He kept his flashlight on the empty case and listened, making himself breathe slowly and think clearly. The sound was irregular, not a steady rhythm like footsteps, more like something navigating by feel, finding its way through a space it was relearning. It paused occasionally, and Devon used those pauses to track its position relative to the doorway between the east wing and the main hall. It was getting closer, but it was not fast. He thought about what Crew had written. It knows the pieces have moved. It is finding them, and understood that the bones had not been taken by anyone. They had moved themselves, pulled toward the thing that needed them the way a wound pulls at its edges. He had no answer to where they had gone, since the case showed no sign of breakage or forced entry. Devon used the next pause to move, backing toward the front desk, keeping his light low, his footsteps quiet. He reached the front desk and put it between himself and the east wing doorway, his hand on the desk phone. Mickey on dispatch. An old building. Electrical issues. Officer reports sounds consistent with possible intruder. That was the version of this that fit inside a normal framework, and Devon held on to it the way a person holds a railing in bad weather, not because it explained everything, but because it was something to hold. The sound in the east wing had stopped. Devon waited. The museum was completely silent for a full 2 minutes, and then the lights in the east wing went out, not gradually, not with a flicker, but all at once. The ambient glow from that section of the building simply gone, leaving the main hall lit only by the desk lamp and the standby lights on the camera monitor. Devon looked at the camera feeds. The east wing cameras were still active in low light mode, and the corridors appeared empty, displays in their cases, nothing visibly wrong. But on the feed for East Wing Corridor 2, Devon could see that the floor was different than it had been at the start of his shift. There was something on it. He leaned closer to the monitor and adjusted the brightness, and looked at the scattered shapes on the corridor floor in the East Wing camera feed, and understood with certainty that settled into him like cold water that the bones had not gone far at all. They had simply left the case and moved to where they apparently needed to be, which was the east wing corridor, where they were now arranged on a floor in a configuration that Devon recognized from Crew's diagram. The same layout, the same relative positions, the same orientation, except that it was no longer behind glass, and it was no longer where anyone had put it. It had put itself there. Devon straightened up from the monitor and stood behind the front desk in the quiet museum and thought about Edmund Crew writing in a deteriorating hand. The arrangement is the only thing keeping from knowing where its pieces are. The arrangement was intact. That was something. That had to count for something. He kept telling himself that while he waited for morning, watching the east wing feeds, not going back there, not touching anything, and trying very hard not to think about what would happen if something disturbed that arrangement before he figured out what to do next. Devon spent the rest of that night at the front desk watching the east wing camera feeds, and not sleeping and not leaving, which were the two things he most wanted to do, and the two things he had decided he could not do. The bones were on the corridor floor in their arrangement, and the arrangement was holding, and nothing else moved between 3 in the morning and 6. And when the sky outside the front windows began to gray toward dawn, Devon made himself get up and do a final round of the upper floors before Loretta Voss arrived to open the building. He did not go into the east wing. He checked the camera feed one more time before he left, and the arrangement was unchanged, and he took that as something close to good news and drove home. He slept 3 hours. He came back. It was the 7th night, and Devon arrived to find the museum exactly as he had left it. The east wing light still out, the bones still on the corridor floor, the display case in the main hall still empty and undisturbed. He stood at the front desk and looked at the camera feeds and thought about Loretta Voss, who had arrived at 8 that morning to open the building and had presumably walked through it in the ordinary way that she walked through it every morning. And he thought about whether she had noticed the lights were out in the east wing, and whether she had gone to check on them, and whether she had seen what was on the floor of corridor 2. He thought about this for a while, and then he thought about the fact that the arrangement was still intact, which meant either Loretta had not gone into the east wing, or she had gone in and had not disturbed anything. And both of those possibilities seemed equally unlikely to Devon, but he was willing to accept either one because the alternative, that Loretta had seen what was on that floor and had simply gone about her day, was a problem he did not have capacity to address right now. He started his round. He did the upper floors first, then the main hall, then stood outside the east wing entrance and listened before going in. The corridor was quiet. He went in slowly with his flashlight on and moved down corridor 2 and crouched next to the arrangement on the floor and looked at it for a long time. It was the same configuration he had seen in Crew's diagram, the same one he had spent 6 nights watching assemble itself inside the display case, now laid out on the stone floor of the oldest section of the museum in the flat beam of his flashlight. He did not touch it. He photographed it from multiple angles, adding to the folder on his phone, and then he straightened up and was turning to leave when he saw her. She was standing at the far end of the corridor near the exit door, and Devon's flashlight beam caught her at the edge of its reach, which meant she was partially lit and partially not, and what the light did reach was enough to stop him completely. She was a woman, or had the shape of one, slight, upright, wearing clothing that did not belong to the century, a dark dress with a high collar and long sleeves, her hair pinned up in a style Devon associated with old photographs. She was completely still. She was looking at him. Devon held his light on her and did not move and said nothing for several seconds, running through the possibilities with a professional part of his brain that was still functioning. A person who had gotten in somehow, a trespasser, a museum employee he had not met. None of those explanations fit the way she was standing, which was the way that a person stands when they have been standing in the same spot for a very long time and have no intention of moving. None of those explanations fit the fact that he could see the exit door through her. Devon said carefully, "Is someone there?" She did not answer or move, continuing to look at him with an expression he could not fully read. though it did not read as threatening. It read as urgent. He took a step toward her, and she turned toward the wall, and he lost her in the shadow, and when his beam found the end of the corridor again, she was gone. Devon stood in the corridor after that, flashlight moving over the space she had occupied, finding nothing. The exit door was closed and locked. There was no other way out. He went back to the arrangement and crouched next to it, thinking about the urgency on her face and the name he had seen in Crew's third journal. The assistant on the original expedition, mentioned several times by first name only. Agnes. He thought about it now. He went back to the archive that same night, pulling the third journal and reading through again, looking specifically for references to Agnes. There were more than he had initially registered. Crew had mentioned her during the local representatives' visits, noting that Agnes had spoken with him at length while Crew documented from a distance, and that she had come to him afterward with a report that was significantly more alarmed than his own notes reflected. Crew had written that Agnes believed the representatives, which he recorded with the detachment of a man, noting an obstacle he had already decided to go around. Agnes appeared with increasing frequency and tension as the journals progressed. She had argued against removing the primary deposit, argued for reburying what they had already taken. In one entry, Crew noted she had threatened to contact the university to shut the dig down, and that he had persuaded her otherwise. The last reference to Agnes was a single line near the end. Agnes remained behind when we departed. She would not say why. Devon set the journal down and sat at the archive table and thought about a woman in period clothing standing at the end of the dark corridor looking at him with urgency. And he thought about a woman who had stayed at an excavation site while everyone else left and who had not, apparently, ever entirely left. He thought about what she might have been trying to show him by being in that corridor, by standing near the arrangement, by looking at him with that specific expression. He thought about the unopened box. There had been a fifth box in the Crew section of the archive that he had not noticed on his first visit, because it had been pushed behind the others and was not labeled in the same way. He had seen it on subsequent visits and had not opened it, because he had been working to the first four in order, and the fifth had not seemed urgent. It seemed urgent now. He found it on the shelf and pulled it out and set it on the table. It was lighter than the others. Inside was a single folder, and inside the folder was a collection of documents that were not in Crew's handwriting. They were in a smaller, more precise hand, the letters carefully formed, the margins clean. Devon read the first page and understood immediately that he was reading Agnes's account of the excavation, her own record, kept separately from Crew's, covering the same period from a different vantage. He read for an hour without stopping. Agnes had been thorough. Agnes had been frightened and thorough, which Devon was beginning to understand was the most useful combination a person could bring to a situation like the one they had both found themselves in. Her account filled in the gaps that Crew's journals had left deliberately vague, and it was in Agnes's account that Devon finally found what he had been trying to understand since the first night he had stood in front of that display case and felt the back of his neck go cold. The thing in the bones was not a creature in any straightforward sense. It was something older than that category, something that the people whose land contained the site had understood for generations as a presence that had been bound rather than born, contained through ritual that predated any written record the expedition had access to. The binding had involved dismemberment, not a living thing, but as something that had already been reduced to its component parts through a process Agnes described only as a convergence, the coming together of something that gathered itself from available material the way a storm gathers from available atmosphere. The bones were not its original form. They were the form it had taken during its last convergence, interrupted, and then contained at the moment of near completion. The arrangement was the interruption. A precise configuration that disrupted the convergence, kept the pieces from fully recognizing each other, kept the thing from finishing what it had started. Agnes had understood all of this. Agnes had tried to make Crew understand it, and when she had failed, she had stayed. Devon read to the end and sat with the folder closed on the table. Agnes had not gone home. She had remained at the site and followed the collection here, to the Hargrove, spending decades watching and waiting for someone who stayed long enough at night to be shown what she needed to show them. Devon was that person. Agnes had been in that corridor not to frighten him, but to direct his attention, to show him what intact looked like before it was too late for that to be useful. He closed the folder. The thing was nearly converged. The movement of the bones out of the case suggested it had progressed beyond what the display configuration could contain. Replication was apparently not the same as the original, and whatever tolerance had existed in the replica had exhausted itself. The arrangement on the corridor floor was still holding, but it would not hold indefinitely, and Devon did not know how much time he had. He put the folder back in the box and the box back on the shelf, and went upstairs and stood in the main hall in the dark and waited. He did not wait long. Agnes appeared near the empty display case. The same partial visibility as before, the same stillness, and this time Devon did not move or speak. He let her look at him, and he looked back at her, and after a moment she turned and moved toward the east wing, and Devon followed. She led him back to the corridor. She stood beside the arrangement on the floor and looked at him, and Devon looked at the arrangement and thought about what Agnes's account had described. The original containment, the specific spacing, the orientation that disrupted the convergence. He crouched next to the bones and looked at them in his flashlight beam and saw what he had not seen before, because he had not known what to look for. The arrangement on the floor was close, but it was not exact. Something was off in the spacing of the smaller bones along the left side, a compression that had not been in Crew's diagram, and Devon understood with a clarity that felt like cold water that the thing was still working even now, still incrementally adjusting, still pushing toward completion, even within the constraint of the arrangement that was supposed to be stopping it. Agnes was looking at him. Devon looked at the bones and thought about touching them, and thought about everything Agnes had written about what happened when the arrangement was disrupted. Then he thought about what would happen if he did nothing. He took out his phone and pulled up the photograph of Crew's diagram and held it next to the arrangement on the floor and began, very carefully, to compare the two. Devon spent the better part of an hour crouched on the floor of East Wing Corridor 2 with his phone in one hand and his flashlight balanced against his knee, comparing Crew's diagram to the arrangement of bones in front of him. The diagram was precise, every bone labeled by type and position, each assigned a location down to the nearest quarter inch. What he was looking at was close but not exact, and the discrepancies were not random. They were consistent with something pushing the arrangement toward a different configuration, a competing geometry beneath the containment one, and the compression along the left side was the most advanced expression of it. A cluster of smaller bones drifted inward by a little over an inch from where Crew's diagram placed them. Agnes stood at the edge of his flashlight beam watching. Devon had stopped reacting to her presence with any visible response, which he recognized as either adaptation or evidence that his baseline for normal had shifted dramatically. He treated her the way he treated the camera feeds, as information to be read rather than reacted to. Her expression had not changed from the urgency he had first read in Corridor 2, which Devon took to mean the urgency was appropriate and ongoing. He looked at the diagram and the bones and made a decision. Agnes's account had been specific about what happened when the arrangement was interfered with incorrectly. Disruption created a window during which convergence accelerated, drawn toward the disturbance the way a current is drawn toward an opening. Touching the bones incorrectly was a provocation. But Agnes had also written something else near the end of her account, in a passage Devon had read 3 times. She had written that the original containment had not been achieved by avoiding contact with the remains. It had been achieved by someone who understood the configuration well enough to enforce it, to hold the arrangement against the thing's resistance, to correct the drift, to maintain the geometry that interrupted the convergence. Someone had done that once. Someone could do it again. The question was whether Devon understood the configuration well enough. He had been studying it for 8 nights. He had Crew's diagram on his phone, and Agnes 3 feet away. He decided it was enough, because he did not have the option of more preparation. He reached out and moved the first bone. It was a small one, a metacarpal from the left-hand cluster, and he moved a precise distance in a precise direction according to the diagram. And the moment he made contact, he understood something that no amount of reading Crew's journals or Agnes's account had prepared him for, which was that the bones were warm. Not body temperature warm. Warmer than that. Warmer than anything that had been sitting on a cold stone floor in an unheated corridor should have been. And the warmth did not feel like retained heat. It felt like the warmth of something that was running, something active, something that had been working continuously for a very long time and had not stopped. Devon moved the bone to its correct position and took his hand back and waited. Nothing happened immediately. He looked at Agnes. She was watching the bones. He moved the next one, a proximal phalanx, correcting its angle by approximately 15 degrees, according to the diagram. And this time when he made contact, he felt something push back. Not physically, not a force against his fingers, but a pressure in his head, behind his eyes, a sudden acute awareness of being perceived that was unlike anything he had felt in 8 nights of being watched. It knew he was touching it. Whatever was using these bones as a locus, as a gathering point, as a material of its convergence. It knew his hands were on its pieces, and it did not want them there. Devon held the bone in position and counted to 5, and then placed it and withdrew and sat back on his heels and breathed. Agnes had not moved. The corridor was quiet. He kept going. He worked through the left side cluster first, because that was where the drift was most advanced, correcting each bone's position against the diagram, and with each correction the pushback intensified. Not dramatically, not in a way that would have been legible to anyone watching from outside, but Devon felt it accumulating the way you feel pressure accumulating in your ears when you descend too fast. A building wrongness that was making it harder to think clearly and harder to keep his hands steady. He was about 2/3 of the way through the left side when the east wing lights came back on. All of them simultaneously, the same way they had gone off. No flicker, no gradual brightening, just darkness and then full fluorescent light flooding the corridor. Devon froze. He looked up from the bones and looked down the corridor, and the corridor was empty except for Agnes, who had not moved, who was looking at it with an expression that had shifted from urgent to something closer to afraid, and Devon had enough data at this point to know that Agnes being afraid was meaningful. He looked back at the bones. The cluster he had been correcting was moving, not the incremental drift he had been documenting for 8 nights. This was faster, the bones sliding against the stone floor with a sound that Devon's brain kept trying to reframe as something explainable and failing, adjusting their positions away from what the diagram specified and toward whatever configuration the thing was trying to achieve. Devon put his hands back in and corrected as fast as he could, working against the movement, and the pressure behind his eyes spiked into something that was closer to pain, and he kept going. It was not a fair contest. He was one person with a photograph on a phone screen, working in a lit corridor with cold fingers and a growing headache, and the thing he was working against had been at this for decades and had no physiological constraints and no interest in stopping. But Devon had spent 11 years doing a job that was mostly about persistence, about showing up and staying and doing the next required thing regardless of how the shift was going, and he applied that now with everything he had. He corrected the left side. He moved to the center. The pushback was constant, and the bones kept drifting, and he kept correcting, and Agnes stayed at the edge of his vision, present and watching, the only fixed point in a corridor that felt like it was slowly changing its relationship to the ordinary world. Devon did not look at the time. He did not think about morning, or about Loretta arriving to open the building, or about what any of this would look like to anyone who walked in. He thought about the diagram of the bones and the next correction, and the one after that, and he kept his hands moving, and he did not stop. He was working on the right side when the temperature in the corridor dropped, not the ambient cold of the east wing, but a different order of magnitude entirely, the kind that felt intentional, that made the air taste like metal and his fingers go numb within 30 seconds. He kept working. The bones on the right side were less drifted than the left had been, but they were moving faster now. The thing apparently redirecting its effort toward the section he had not yet corrected, and Devon's numb fingers made the work slower and less precise. He checked the diagram and checked the bones and made the corrections as accurately as he could manage, and the pressure behind his eyes had gone from pain to something he did not have a word for, a sustained wrongness that made the edges of his vision unreliable and made the corridor feel like it was breathing. He did not stop. 3 bones from the end of the right side, Devon made a mistake. He moved the tarsal bone to what he read as its correct position on the diagram, and then looked at the diagram again, and realized he had misread the label in the washed-out light of the fluorescent overhead, and the position he had placed it in was not the position crew had specified. He corrected it immediately, moving it back and then to the right position, and in the window between the incorrect placement and the corrected one, a window of perhaps 4 seconds, something happened in the corridor that Devon experienced as a sound and a pressure simultaneously, a deep concussive sensation that had no obvious source, and that made the fluorescent light overhead flicker and made Agnes, for the first time since he had encountered her, make a sound. It was not a word. It was the sound of someone who has been holding their breath for a very long time and has just been pushed past the point of holding it. Devon placed the tarsal bone in its correct position and moved the final 2 bones and corrected them in rapid succession, and then sat back on the floor of the corridor and put his hands in his lap and looked at the arrangement. It matched the diagram. He checked it against the photograph 3 times, section by section, and it matched. The corridor was quiet. The temperature was still wrong, but it was no longer dropping. The pressure behind his eyes was fading in the way that pain fades after the source is removed, slowly and unevenly, leaving a residue. Devon looked at Agnes. She was looking at the arrangement. Her expression had changed again, not afraid anymore, not urgent, something closer to relief. Though Devon was not certain that was the right word for what he was reading on a face that had been reading differently than living faces read for as long as he had been watching it. She looked at him. Devon looked back. He wanted to ask her something, but he did not have a question that fit into words. Or rather, he had too many questions and no way to know which one she could answer and which ones no one could. He looked at the arrangement on the floor and thought about the fact that it was correct now, that it matched the diagram, that the convergence was interrupted again. And then he thought about the fact that it was on a corridor floor, not in a display case, not in any kind of enclosure, and that Loretta Voss was going to arrive in approximately 4 hours to open the museum, and was going to find him sitting on the floor of the East Wing next to a collection of scattered bones that had somehow exited their display case, and that this was going to require an explanation that Devon did not currently have. He looked at Agnes, and she was still watching him, and he looked at the bones and thought about what came next, which was a part of the problem he had been deferring since the first night he had stood in front of that display case and seen the hand raised. Correcting the arrangement had bought time. He did not know how much. The thing had been working against the containment for decades with no intervention and had nearly finished. It would keep working. The arrangement on the corridor floor was not a permanent solution. It was what he had available tonight. And tonight it had been enough. But tomorrow night it might not be. And the night after that the margin would be thinner still. Devon sat on the cold floor of the East Wing corridor with his numb hands in his lap and looked at the diagram on his phone and thought about what a permanent solution would require. And Agnes stood at the edge of the light and waited, because she had been waiting for a very long time, and she was patient in the way that people become patient when they have run out of alternatives. Devon did not go home that morning. He sat on the corridor floor until the sky outside the East Wing's high, narrow windows went from black to gray to the pale, flat white of early morning, and then he got up slowly, his knees stiff and his back aching and his hands still not entirely warm, and he walked to the front desk and sat in a chair and looked at the camera feeds. The East Wing Corridor 2 feed showed the arrangement on the floor, unchanged from when he had finished correcting it, the bones in their precise configuration on the cold stone. The display case in the main hall was still empty. Everything else in the museum was exactly as it should have been, which Devon understood by now was not the same thing as everything being fine. He heard Loretta Voss's key in the front door at 7:58, and he stood up from the desk and waited. Loretta was a small, precise woman in her early 60s who had worked at the Hargrove for longer than Devon had been in security, and she came through the door with particular efficiency of someone who had done the same thing the same way for a very long time, bag over one shoulder, travel coffee in hand, eyes already moving to the condition of the front hall. She saw Devon standing at the desk and stopped. He was not supposed to be there at 7:58. His shift ended at 6. She looked at him and he looked at her, and Devon made a decision about how much of the truth to tell her, which was all of it, because he had spent 8 nights trying to manage this alone, and the arrangement was holding for now. But it was not going to hold forever, and he needed someone else to know what was in this building. He talked for 40 minutes. Loretta did not interrupt him, standing near the front desk with her travel coffee going cold, listening to all of it, the blackouts, the photographs, the archive boxes, Crew's letter, Agnes's account, the convergence, the arrangement on the corridor floor. When he finished, she asked to see the photographs. Devon handed her his phone, and she scrolled through them slowly, her expression doing something complicated that Devon read as a person encountering confirmation of something they had been carefully not thinking about for a long time. When she handed the phone back, she told him that she had worked at the Hargrove for 31 years, and that the East Wing had always been colder than the rest of the building, and that 3 previous night security officers had left the post without giving adequate notice, 2 of them in their first week. She said this without elaboration, and Devon did not ask for any. She asked him what he needed. Devon told her he needed access to the East Wing to be restricted. No visitors, no staff, no one in Corridor 2 for any reason. He needed the museum's facilities team to stay out of the East Wing until further notice, which Loretta could accomplish by reporting a water intrusion issue that required assessment. He needed the archive boxes, all 5 of them, moved somewhere he could access them quickly without going to the basement. And he needed time, which was the thing he was least certain he had. Loretta did all of it by noon. Devon went home, slept 6 hours, and came back. The 9th night was quiet in the way he had learned to distrust. The corridor arrangement was intact. Agnes did not appear. He checked the bones against the diagram at the start of his shift and at 2-hour intervals, and the configuration held each time. And by 4 in the morning, he had cautiously begun to consider that the correction had done more than buy time. He was examining this with careful skepticism when he noticed the smell. It was faint at first, something he caught at the edge of his awareness on his 3 o'clock round and could not immediately place. A dry mineral smell that reminded him of struck flint or the air before a lightning strike. He noted it and moved on. On his 4 o'clock round, it was stronger and coming from Corridor 2. The arrangement was correct. Every bone in its specified position. Nothing drifted. But the smell was coming from it. He stepped into the corridor and crouched next to the bones, and the warmth he had felt when he first touched them was still there, still radiating upward. But it was different now. Not the steady working heat of something in process, but something building, something accumulating. And Devon understood with a cold clarity that the correction had not set the convergence back. It had accelerated it. By restoring the precise arrangement, he had given the thing exactly what it needed, had handed it the configuration it had been working toward for decades. And whatever the arrangement was supposed to interrupt, it was not interrupting anymore, because the arrangement itself had become the mechanism of completion. He stood up fast and stepped back from the bones, and looked at them and thought about Agnes. Agnes had led him to the archive. Agnes had led him to Corridor 2. Agnes had stood at the edge of his light, and watched him work through 4 hours of correction, and had not stopped him. Devon thought about that. He thought about Crew's letter. He thought about what a thing would do once it knew exactly where all its pieces were. The smell was getting stronger. Devon looked at the corridor and thought about his options with a rapid, pragmatic clarity. of someone who understood that the window for options was closing. He could disrupt the arrangement, pull bones out of position, break the configuration, do intentionally what he had done accidentally with the tarsal bone, and hopefully interrupt whatever was now building. The risk was the same as Agnes's account had described, the window of accelerated convergence. But the alternative was standing in the corridor while the thing finished what Crew had accidentally helped it start. He was reaching for the nearest bone when Agnes appeared. She was closer than she had ever been. Not at the end of the corridor, not at the edge of his light, but directly across the arrangement from him. Close enough that Devon could see her face clearly for the first time, and what he saw there was not urgency and not fear. It was something that looked like resolution. The expression of someone who has waited a very long time for a specific moment and has finally recognized it arriving. She looked at him, and then she looked at the arrangement, and then she stepped forward and onto it. Devon did not understand what he was seeing for the first moment. Agnes moved onto the bones the way someone steps onto ice to test it, carefully, deliberately, and the effect was immediate and violent. Not violent in the physical sense, but in the way that a pressure changes when a seal is broken, a sudden release that Devon felt in his chest and his ears and behind his eyes simultaneously. The smell vanished. The warmth coming off the bone stopped. The corridor lights, which had been flickering for the past hour, went steady. Agnes stood in the center of the arrangement, and Devon watched her become less visible, not disappearing in any dramatic way, but simply fading, the way a sound fades when its source stops, gradual and then gone. The corridor was quiet. Devon crouched next to the bones and put his hand near them and felt nothing, no warmth, no pressure, no sense of being perceived. They were bones, old bones on a cold stone floor, inert and still. He stayed in the corridor for a long time. He went and got the crude diagram from the archive box Loretta had moved to the office, and he came back and he began, carefully and deliberately, to disassemble the arrangement, not randomly. He moved each bone away from the others with the intention of preventing any future accidental configuration, separating them. And when he was done, the corridor floor held scattered bones with no relationship to each other and no geometry that any intelligence could use. It took him 2 hours. When he finished, he sat on the floor of East Wing, Corridor 2, and looked at what he had done and thought about Agnes, who had understood from the beginning what the correct solution was, and had spent decades waiting for someone who would stay long enough to make it possible. She had not needed him to stop the convergence. She had needed him to complete the arrangement so that she could do what she had been trying to do since the day she stayed behind at the excavation site. Give the thing a vessel it could not refuse, a configuration so precise and so complete that when she walked into it, the convergence completed and terminated simultaneously, the thing getting what it had been seeking for a century, and finding that what it had been seeking was not what it had been expecting. Devon did not know if that was the right way to understand it. He was a security officer, not an archaeologist, not a scholar of ritual containment, not anything that the past 9 nights had prepared him to be. He was someone who showed up and stayed and did the next required thing. And the next required thing now was to write it down. He went to the front desk. He got his log. He wrote the last entry. He described everything that had happened in East Wing, Corridor 2 on the 9th night, clearly and in order, and at the end he wrote, "The arrangement is dissolved. The bones are separated. Agnes is gone. I believe it is over." Then he put the log on the desk, and he went back to the East Wing and stood in the corridor one more time and looked at the scattered bones and the empty stone floor and listened to the museum, which was quiet in the way it had not been quiet since his first night, a different quality of silence, the silence of a space that was simply empty rather than the silence of a space that was holding its breath. He turned off his flashlight. He stood in the dark for a moment. Then he walked out the East Wing and through the main hall and past the empty display case out the front door into the early morning, and he did not look back, and his car was the only one in the lot, and the drive home was very quiet, and he did not know what he was going to write on his availability form for the following week, but he knew he was not going to be at the Hargrove. Loretta Voss arrived at the Hargrove Natural History Museum at 7:58 the following morning. The same as every morning, bag over one shoulder and travel coffee in hand. She came through the front door, and her eyes moved to the front desk the way they had every morning for the past several days, half expecting to find Devon still there. The desk was empty. His log was on it, open to the last entry, and Loretta set her coffee down and read it standing up, all of it, from the first line to the last. Then she closed the log and looked out at the main hall and the empty display case and the corridor entrance to the east wing, and she stood there for a moment doing the same calculation Devon had done on his first night, distinguishing between a building that was simply old and a building that had something wrong with it. The building felt different. She could not have said exactly how, only that the quality of the silence had changed, that the east wing did not pull at her attention the way it had for 31 years, that the main hall felt like a main hall again. She picked up her coffee. She had a museum to open. Devon's car was still in the lot.